A rare antique, gentlemen. A savage of the wilderness, speaking the language of the devil, with a beauty not meant for any white man.
He bought a Cherokee girl for $10, set her free, but she whispered, "Can I stay, even if I'm free?" Hollow Rock, 1878. Dust. That was the first thing Ayanna felt. A fine, hot powder clinging to her skin, settling into the rips of her worn dress, grinding in every breath. It was a physical weight, a suffocating presence that made her feel as though she were breathing small stones. The Hollow Rock sun was merciless, an unforgiving tyrant that poured down into the town square like a heavy liquid, blurring every line and turning the very air into a massive forge. The roar of the crowd, the clatter of old wagons, and the shrill calls of a slave trader blended into a crude symphony, a noise that could only be created by chaos and desperation. Ayanna stood at the center of it all, her oak-colored eyes holding an uncanny stillness. Her wrists were chained to a wooden post, the cold metal rings chafing against her sun-scorched skin. She could feel every scratch on her wrists and the weight of the chain, a weight that was not just physical, but spiritual. Despite her captivity, there was no hint of weakness in her posture. Her face, with its sharp features and high cheekbones, a hallmark of her Cherokee heritage, showed no emotion. Her eyes looked at no one, but they took in everything. The grimacing faces of the gold miners, the idle curiosity of the few women standing at a distance, and above all, the filthy grin of Orson Pike, the man who reeked of old liquor and sour sweat. "Look here." His voice was hoarse and shrill, echoing through the noise. He held out his hand, filthy and with black fingernails. A rare antique, gentleman, a savage of the wilderness, speaking the language of the devil, with a beauty. He paused, glanced at Ayanna, and cackled. Not meant for any white man. He yanked the chain, and the dry, rattling sound of metal hitting wood rang out. Ayanna did not flinch. She simply stood there, as steady as an old oak tree that had weathered many storms. She had learned that fear was just another language for them to mock. Like the desert wind, they would blow through and leave a scar, but they could never break her. She listened to the sound of the desert wind blowing through the cracks of the square, the lonely, weak call of a bird. They spoke to her of freedom, and she held on to those sounds, like small pebbles carefully hidden in an empty pouch. They could hold her body captive, but they could never take away the songs of the wind, the smell of salt. Elias Blackwood closed his eyes and took a deep breath. It was a dry, strong, clean scent, a stark contrast to the foul odor of Hollow Rock. He stood next to his small wagon, an empty sack over his shoulder. His work here was simple: trade the pelts he had hunted for salt and ammunition. Elias did not look at the crowd. He was all too familiar with the cruelty and indifference of towns like Hollow Rock. They were the scars left by war and greed on the body of this land, and he had learned to ignore them, just as he ignored an old wound. He was a man of silence. Every word he spoke had a purpose, never wasted. His face was etched with the lines of sun, wind, and sorrow. His eyes were always fixed on some distant point on the horizon, as if his soul was never truly present. The buckskin jacket he wore was worn and frayed, but it was clean, and the rifle he carried was well cared for. Everything about Elias spoke of one thing: he was a man who lived alone and needed only to be alone. He heard the commotion in the center of the square suddenly grow louder. Elias simply raised an eyebrow slightly. Probably another brawl, or something similar. He took the sack off his shoulder and placed it on the salt merchant's scale. 50 pounds, his voice was low, rough, and devoid of emotion, and 2 boxes of .44 rounds. He avoided the gaze of the merchant, who was still staring blankly at the crowd. A dry gust of wind blew through, carrying a thin layer of dust. Elias frowned. He felt a sense of unease, not because of the noise, not because of the dust, but because of the heavy, uncomfortable feeling in the air, something different from the usual chaos. He turned his head. For the first time since arriving, he saw the crowd surrounding a post. He saw a man auctioning something. And finally, he saw Ayanna, his eyes fixed on her form, on her determined silence amidst the storm of humiliation. He felt no pity. He felt a stark truth. That girl was not a piece of property. She was a human being stripped of life, and in her eyes he saw a faint flicker, a flicker of resilience, and he was reminded of the flicker that had once existed in his own heart. Orson Pike was in the middle of his auction. He had moved from words to actions, grabbing Ayanna's collar, forcing her to face the crowd, boasting crudely. "Come on, who will bid? $10. Just $10 for a piece of..." He was cut off by a low voice. $10. It was not a shout, nor was it an offer. It was a statement, an undeniable truth, like a gunshot in the open air. The entire crowd fell silent. Orson Pike turned, a look of confusion on his face. He saw Elias Blackwood, a tall man, with cold eyes, standing in the middle of the sunny square. He had dropped the sack, and it fell to the ground with a heavy thud, creating a small cloud of dust. "What did you say?" Orson asked again, trying to regain his confidence. Elias did not answer. He walked closer, his strides long and decisive. He did not draw a gun. He simply stood there, as solid as a rock. He took out an old, tattered money pouch from his pocket and counted out 10 shiny silver dollars. He handed them to Orson. "Redeem her." Orson Pike looked at Elias, then at Ayanna, then at the silent, watching crowd. He snatched the money, a look of annoyance on his face. He grabbed the chain with a rough movement. He wanted one last performance, one last humiliation, but he had failed. Elias Blackwood had stood between him and Ayanna. Elias only held out his hand, not touching her, but touching the chain that bound her. He looked straight into her eyes, and that was the first time Ayanna had seen a gaze that held no disgust or lust, only truth and weariness. With a decisive movement, Elias snapped the chain. The sound of breaking metal rang out like thunder on a sunny afternoon. Ayanna felt the freedom on her wrists. She could not believe it. In that moment, she saw a man who had not rescued her from slavery, but had simply returned her freedom to her. Silence enveloped them as they left Hollow Rock. The town's noise faded behind them, giving way to the steady sound of hooves and the lonely howl of the desert wind, carrying the scent of wild sage. Ayanna sat in the wagon, her back straight, her hands on her lap. She dared not look directly at Elias, who sat beside her, with a face as impassive as stone. She looked around, trying to remember every detail of this land. The rugged mountains, the giant cacti, and the sparse dry bushes on the red earth. This land was wild, untamed. Like her, Elias did not speak a word. He just drove the wagon, his eyes fixed on the path ahead. Ayanna felt his presence, a strong but non-threatening presence. He did not ask her name. He did not ask where she was from. He did not tell her who he was. All he did was take her away from Hollow Rock, from a place where she was considered property. It seemed he was simply fulfilling a duty. She lightly touched her wrists. The marks of the chain were still there, a deep red stain on her skin. But she no longer felt the coldness of the metal. She felt the wind, and she felt the sun. Her freedom was like a young bird just released from its cage. It did not know where to fly, but it knew it was free. Ayanna turned to look at Elias. For the first time, she saw the scars on his face. A long scar on his left cheek, hidden beneath a sparse beard. His eyes held a deep sorrow, but not weakness. It was the sorrow of a man who had fought and lost a great deal. She thought, perhaps he too was a fragment, like her, a fragment picked up from war, lonely and lost. They arrived as the last light of dusk faded. The homestead was nestled in a limestone valley, surrounded by jagged hills. The air here was colder, cleaner, and filled only with the sound of the wind sweeping past the rocks. The small house, made of wood and clay, looked lonely. It did not look like a home, but a final fortress, a defense against the outside world. Two children stood on the porch, watching them in silence. The older boy, perhaps 10 years old, with eyes full of suspicion and caution. The younger girl, about 6, with blonde hair and clear eyes, was simply curious. Ayanna knew who they were, Jed and Clara. Elias got down from the wagon, not saying a word to his children. He simply helped Ayanna down. "Go inside," he said, his voice low and dry. Ayanna stepped into the house. The old smell of wood, ashes, and loneliness hit her nose. He did not tell her who she was or what she should do. He simply pointed to a small room with no windows at the end of the hall. "Sleep there," he said. "You're safe here." Jed followed them, his suspicious eyes never leaving Ayanna. Elias turned back to his son. "You and Clara go to bed," he said with finality. The boy did not move. Elias bent down, placing a hand on Jed's shoulder. "There's nothing to be afraid of," he said, his voice lower. "She's not a slave." Then he looked at Ayanna and repeated the words, as if to reassure himself. "She's not a slave." Ayanna went into the small room and closed the door. She had no belongings, no personal items, but she had a room, and more importantly, she had a sense of safety. She sat down on the cold floor and breathed slowly. She couldn't say she was out of a cage, but at least she was in a place where she could begin to build a new home. Winter had arrived, bringing a thin layer of frost to the hills. The wind was no longer a fierce roar, but a cold whisper that swept past the rocks. Inside the cabin, the air was warmer and quieter. Ayanna sat by the fireplace, the dancing flames illuminating her face. Her hands, once bound by chains, now held a small needle, carefully mending a torn shirt of Jed's cestasee. She wasn't using a simple patch. She was using a piece of an old blanket and was embroidering a small, intricate diamond with red thread, a Cherokee motif. It was a silent job, a quiet act of healing that needed no words. Elias stood in the doorway, a hunting knife in his hand that he was sharpening. He didn't say a word, but his eyes never left Ayanna. He saw her focus, the gentleness of her hands. He was used to the silence in this house. It was a cold, empty silence after his wife died. But now, it was a different kind of silence. It was the silence of a person at work, a silence that held life. The sound of the blade on the whetstone was the only thing that broke the stillness, but it was also a familiar sound, a part of this house. Jed, sitting in a corner, pretended to read. He occasionally glanced at Ayanna, then went back to his book. He no longer looked at her with suspicion. Elias, seeing Ayanna care for Jed, felt a small crack in the wall he had built to protect his heart. A crack that brought no pain, but an unexpected relief. The cold had eased, a rare sunny winter day. Clara ran into the house, her cheeks flushed from the cold. Her small hands were tightly clutching something. She ran straight to Ayanna, who was cleaning. "Dark-haired woman," she whispered. Ayanna smiled, a rare smile, but one bright enough to light up her entire face. "What is it, little one?" Clara opened her hand, revealing a small, smooth stone, sparkling as if it held a hidden diamond. "I found it," Clara said, her voice full of pride. "It sparkles like your eyes when they see the sun." She placed the stone in Ayanna's palm. Ayanna looked at the stone, then into Clara's clear eyes. This child did not see an old piece of property, a woman in chains. She saw beauty. She saw the sparkle inside. Elias, standing in the doorway, stopped. He had heard the conversation. He had seen the smile on Ayanna's face, a genuine and bright smile. He turned his back and quietly walked out, leaving the two of them alone in that moment. After the snow melted, the valley began to breathe again, its dormant life stirring beneath the thawing soil. One afternoon, Ayanna sat under the sprawling branches of an ancient oak tree, its bark gnarled and thick like the hide of an old beast. She was weaving a basket from willow branches, her nimble fingers working with a rhythm as old as the tree itself. The air smelled of wet earth and pine, and the sound of a distant hawk was the only thing that broke the quiet harmony. Clara, drawn by the methodical movements of Ayanna's hands, came to sit beside her. She had a doll made of corn husks, its face a simple stitched smile. "Tell me a story," Clara said, her voice a small breeze. Ayanna paused, her fingers still. She had spent a lifetime holding back her stories, her language, her history. It was a vulnerability she had never allowed herself to show. She was a woman of silence, a guardian of things unseen, but Clara's eyes were filled with an innocent light that disarmed her. Jed, who had been chopping wood a short distance away, stopped to listen. He pretended to be focused on his task, but his movements were slower. His body turned just slightly toward the shade of the oak tree. He had learned to be suspicious of stories, to see them as a way to hide the truth. But there was something about Ayana's silence that was different. It was a silence that promised truth, not deception. Ayana looked at Clara, and a flicker of a smile touched her lips. She began to speak, her voice low and melodic, like a hidden stream in a canyon. Long, long ago, she said, her hands never stopping their work, the Great Spirit gave the animals two paths. One was the path of the sun, and the other was the path of the moon. The wild horse, full of fire and spirit, chose the path of the sun. He ran with the sun, his mane aflame, his hooves like thunder. He was free, but he was also alone. The forest wolf, with her soft paws and wise eyes, chose the path of the moon. She moved with the shadows, her fur silver, her howl a song to the night. She was part of a pack, but she longed for the light. Ayana paused, a willow branch woven perfectly into the basket. Clara was mesmerized, her little hands gripping the doll tightly. Jed, forgetting his pretense, dropped his axe and slowly walked closer, his eyes fixed on Ayana's face. One day, Ayana continued, her voice gaining a quiet power, the sun's fire and the moon's shadows met in the sky. In a great storm, the wild horse ran from the lightning and the wolf hid from the thunder. They were two halves of the same world, but they could not be together. The Great Spirit saw their loneliness and gave them a choice. The wild horse could continue to run free, but alone. Or he could choose to walk the path where the sun and moon meet, a path where he would not be tamed, but would choose to run alongside a companion. Jed knelt down, not caring about the dirt on his pants. What did the horse choose? He asked, his voice raw with a sudden, powerful curiosity. Ayana looked at him, and her smile returned, softer this time. He chose the path of the meeting place, she said, her voice a whisper. He learned to trust the wolf, and the wolf learned to run with the fire in his heart. And from that day on, the world had both day and night, storms and calm, and the wild horse was not less free for having a companion. He was more. Clara clapped her hands with delight. That's a beautiful story, she exclaimed. Jed remained silent for a long moment, pondering the words. They weren't caged, he finally said, more to himself than to anyone. They were just chosen. Ayana simply nodded, her eyes soft. From the doorway of the barn, Elias watched. The sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in colors of orange and pink, a mix of sun and moon. He had seen the children, two wild creatures themselves, sit still and listen to Ayana. He had seen the way Ayana, a woman he had bought to give her freedom, had given a part of her own soul to his children. He saw her weaving not just a basket, but a family, a story of things not tamed, but chosen. In that moment, he realized that he had not just redeemed her from a life of slavery, he had redeemed his entire family. And he was not a solitary oak tree anymore, but part of a new forest. Dusk, the desert sky was on fire. Streaks of orange, red, and purple blended into a majestic painting. It was a raw beauty, a proud display of nature. Ayana stood on the porch, alone, looking towards the horizon. She was learning to read the language of this land. She knew that the brilliant red of the sky meant wind was coming. She knew that complete silence meant a storm was approaching. Elias walked out and stood a short distance from her. He said nothing, just stood there with his arms crossed. They were not a romantic couple. They were two lonely people, two wounded souls, standing next to each other, sharing a peaceful moment. The silence between them no longer held the tension of the early days. It had become something else, an understanding that needed no words, a quiet respect. The wind blew through, catching her hair, making his shirt flutter. Elias suddenly had a thought. He had bought her freedom, but perhaps she had brought him something much more valuable, a quiet companionship. Jed had always been a serious child. He had to learn to grow up very early, when his mother died. He had witnessed his father's breakdown, and he had built a wall to defend himself. He didn't trust Ayana. He had seen how white people discriminated against her. and he was afraid she would bring trouble. One afternoon, he was chopping wood in the barn, and Ayanna walked past. He stopped, the axe in his hand. "Why are you here?" he asked, his voice small but full of challenge. "My father already paid for you to leave." Ayanna sat down on a pile of dry hay, looking straight into his eyes. "Your father bought my freedom," she said, her voice calm. "And he gave me the money. But I decided to stay." "Why?" the boy asked again, his voice trembling. "What do you want from us?" Ayanna didn't answer right away. She looked towards the wild horses running on the distant prairie. "I don't want anything," she said. "I just want a home, a place to belong, not to be caged. Like those horses." She looked back at Jed, and her eyes held an understanding. "They aren't owned by anyone, but they choose a herd to belong to. So do I." Jed fell silent, his eyes looking at the horses, then back at Ayanna. He had seen the truth in her words. He nodded, a small but meaningful nod, and went back to chopping wood. The first snow of winter blanketed the Coyote Ridge Valley. The wind blew fiercely, and large snowflakes hit the window like small stones. Elias walked into Ayanna's small room, an old leather pouch in his hand. "Ayanna," he said, his voice lower than usual. She was mending an old shawl, and she looked up. The flickering firelight made her eyes sparkle. "The winter is almost over," he said, placing the pouch on the table. "When the snow melts, you can leave." Ayanna looked at the pouch, then at him. "Go where?" she asked, her voice calm but full of confusion. Elias opened the pouch. Inside was the money he had paid for her, 10 shiny silver dollars, along with some dried food and a water skin. "This money is yours," he said. "I don't owe you anything, and you don't owe me. You are free. You can go. Build a new life, a life you can choose freely." Ayanna looked at him, her eyes no longer as calm as before. In that moment, she felt as if her heart had cracked, like dry earth meeting the first rain. She saw his kindness, but also his rejection. She saw him wanting to send her away, not because she was bad, but because he couldn't accept a new bond. Ayanna did not touch the pouch. She looked straight at Elias. Outside, the wind howled, and the snowflakes fell thicker and thicker. The small room became tense. "I can go," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But I don't want to. No place needs a person like me more than this place." Elias frowned. "You can find a job," he said, his voice sounding forced. "You can build a life again. No place needs a person like me more than Jed and Clara." Ayanna cut him off. She stood up, her eyes sparkling strangely. "And no place needs a person like me more than you." Elias took a step back, surprise clearly on his face. "I don't understand," he said. Ayanna walked closer, standing opposite him. "I'm not a slave," she said, her voice strong and decisive. "And I don't want to be your slave. I want to be chosen." She placed her hand on the old leather pouch, pushing it away. "I can stay, not as a slave, but as your wife." Elias stood there, like a stone statue. The snowstorm outside seemed to have quieted. He looked into Ayanna's eyes, and in them, he saw a fire. A fire of resilience, of choice. He saw a woman who did not need to be saved, but only to be seen. Spring had arrived. Under the sun, the dry patch of land behind the house was slowly being reborn. Ayanna, with an old hoe, was carefully tilling the soil. She wasn't planting the usual white man's vegetables. She was planting corn, beans, squash, and a few wild herbs she knew from her tribe. Her hands, once familiar with embroidery thread, were now familiar with soil. She dug, she nurtured, and she whispered to the seeds, just as she whispered to her own soul. Jed and Clara followed her like shadows. Jed, initially still suspicious, now held a small bucket, helping her carry water from the well. Clara, with a child's innocence, dug in the soil with her fingers and giggled every time she found an earthworm. Elias stood on the porch, watching the three of them work. The land that was once dry and dead was now full of life. Nụ cười của Clara, tiếng cười của Jet và sự tĩnh lặng đầy sức sống của Ayanna đã biến một khu vườn chết thành một khu vườn hồi sinh. In the warm sunlight, he saw Ayanna teaching Jed how to plant seeds. He saw Jed, the once rigid boy, now bending down, working diligently. He saw Clara running and playing, and he heard her laughter. They were not an ordinary family. They were a family created from fragments, from choice. And this garden was the heart of that family. The April sky was heavy. The wind carried the smell of damp earth and the threat of an approaching rain. The sunlight had faded, leaving a leaden gray over the Coyote Ridge Valley. The peace of spring was suddenly broken by an unfamiliar sound, the grinding of wagon wheels on stone and the rough sound of horse hooves. Elias was sharpening a hoe in the shed, the sound of metal on stone stopping abruptly. He looked up, his eyes narrowing toward the road leading into the ranch. Ayanna was picking vegetables in the garden, her cloth dress fluttering in the wind. She also heard the sound, and she stood up straight, her hands clutching the leaves. The wind blew hard, making her hair fly across her face, partially obscuring her watchful eyes. An old, filthy wagon, kicking up a cloud of dust, drove straight into the yard. Elias walked out of the shed, the hoe still in his hand, his eyes never leaving the arrivals. The wagon stopped. The first man to step down was Orson Pike. His clothes were still dirty and old, but his face now held not just greed, but also hatred. Behind him were two big, menacing men, guns in their hands. "Well, well, well," Orson said, his voice shrill and full of contempt. "This widower's garden is all green now." He glanced at Ayanna, his eyes sweeping from the garden to her, as if she were one of the wild plants he was seeing. "And here's my Indian girl. She looks like she's fattened up a bit." Elias stood there, as solid as an old oak. He didn't say a word. His gaze was cold and steady. Orson Pike took another step, the smile on his face vanishing as he saw that Ayanna did not flinch, but stood there, her oak-colored eyes looking straight at him. "I've come to take back what's mine," Orson said, his voice now hardened. "A savage has no right to live in a place like this. It'll bring trouble. It'll pollute your blood and your children's." One of the hired guns laughed hideously. Elias looked at Orson Pike, then at the two hired guns. He turned to look at Ayanna, and in that moment, a word was spoken. "She is not property." His voice was low and heavy, as if it had been suppressed for a long time. "She belongs to no one but herself." "Is that so?" Orson sneered. "Then let's see if she's worth that freedom." He gestured to the two hired guns. The wind began to howl, and the first raindrops began to fall, wetting the dry dust. The rain poured down, torrential and brutal, washing away the dust in the yard. Thunder rumbled in the sky, and lightning flashed, illuminating their tense faces. A gun went off. It wasn't a loud shot, but a small, sharp pop, yet it was the shot that started the battle. Elias ne vien darn dotin mort kach nern. He was no longer a lonely, hopeless man. He was a veteran. He had fought in a war. And now he was fighting for something even more important, his family. He did not draw his gun, he held the hoe, and that was all he needed. Elias was a quiet storm. He moved fast, decisively, and brutally. The hoe in his hand was not a weapon, it was an extension of his will. He struck the first hired gun hard. The man fell, moaning in pain. The second hired gun fired wildly, but the bullets flew into the air, missing their target. "She's not property," Elias roared, his voice blending with the thunder. "She's my wife." That declaration was more than just a statement. It was a choice. It was a commitment. It was a truth. Orson Pike stood watching, his face pale with fear. He had never thought that a widowed, solitary man could fight like this. He had run into a wall, a man who had lost everything and had now found something to fight for. Elias decisively defeated the second hired gun. He collapsed, unconscious. "Elias Quaylai, doimat ang dong o." Orson Pike backed away, his hands trembling. He was no longer a slave trader. He was just a coward facing a man who had decided not to lose anything more. Elias raised the hoe, and Orson Pike could only give a weak scream. "No, no, I'll go, I'll never come back." He ran out of the yard, pathetically, in the pouring rain. The storm was not yet over. The rain was still falling, but it had softened a little. The ranch yard was now a muddy swamp, covered in blood and rainwater. Elias stood there, the hoe in his hand falling to the ground. He was breathing heavily, a wound on his shoulder bleeding. He felt no pain. He only felt the emptiness after a battle. He looked towards the house, where Jed and Clara were hiding behind the window, their eyes wide with fear. He had scared them. He had turned their home into a battlefield. Ayanna walked out of the house. She was not afraid. She was not trembling. She simply walked to Elias, stepping through the mud and blood, and stood facing him. She did not say a word. She took a clean cloth from her pocket and began to wipe the wound on his shoulder. Her hands were cold from the rain, but gentle and full of love. Elias stood there, silent, feeling the warmth from her hands. He looked at her. The rain was falling on her face, mixing with the tears that did not fall. She was not crying, but there was something in her eyes that had cracked, like dry earth meeting rain. Elias felt it, and his heart, once as hard as stone, suddenly softened. He placed his hand over hers, and that was the first time they had ever touched. It was not a touch of lust, it was a touch of gratitude, a touch of connection, a touch of two fragments finding each other in a storm. Weeks passed. The scars of the battle had healed. The marks in the yard had been washed away by subsequent rains. Ayanna's garden was now greener and more vibrant than ever. The corn had begun to grow ears, the beans had climbed the fences, and the wild Cherokee herbs had bloomed. It was a garden of life, a testament to resilience. One morning, Ayanna was picking vegetables, and Clara ran to her, her small hands clutching her skirt. "Mama," the little girl said, her voice small and sweet like a bird's song. Ayanna stood up straight. She didn't react immediately. She looked down at Clara, her eyes full of surprise, and then she smiled. It was a warm, radiant smile, a smile only for children. Jed, who was busy tilling the soil nearby, heard it. He didn't say anything, but he turned and looked at Ayanna, and in his eyes there was no more suspicion, only acceptance. Jed walked closer, and he asked Ayanna about the stories of the Cherokee gods. She told him, and he listened intently, as if they were fairy tales of a land he had never known. Elias saw it all. He saw how Ayanna had become an indispensable part of the family. He had found a woman not to replace his wife, but to become a part of a new story. That night, after the children had gone to sleep, Ayanna sat by the fireplace. She was holding a worn dress of Elias's late wife. It was a simple dress, but it was a relic, a symbol of his past, of his pain and loss. The dress had a few tears. Ayanna took a needle and thread, and she began to mend it. But she wasn't just mending. She was embroidering Cherokee patterns onto it. She embroidered images of birds, flowers, diamonds, and circles, all with vibrant colored threads, a perfect combination of what was lost and what was found. Elias walked in, and he saw her at work. He didn't say a word, just stood there, looking at the dress. He saw the patches. He saw the Cherokee patterns. It was a moment of truth. Ayanna was not a replacement. She was a connection. She had not tried to erase his past. She had embraced it, and she had woven a part of herself into it. Elias felt something break inside him. He didn't cry. He didn't shout. But a single tear rolled silently down his cheek, fell, and disappeared into the darkness. It was a tear of release. A year later, the Coyote Ridge Ranch had completely changed. It was no longer a lonely place. It was a home. Ayanna had taught the children to read in English, and Jed and Clara had taught her country songs. Elias had built an extra room, a small room, with a large window, where the sunlight could pour in. It was a place where they gathered, where they laughed, where they told stories. A year after the storm, the September sunlight was golden and gentle, blanketing the Coyote Ridge Valley. The air carried the smell of dry earth, ripe corn, and smoke from the kitchen chimney. It was a new rhythm, a rhythm created not by loneliness, but by life. Elias was sitting on a wooden chair, carefully carving a small wooden horse for Clara. He was no longer the silent man who only knew how to hide from the world. He was still quiet, but there was a warmth, a gentleness in his eyes. Ayanna stood beside him, hanging up cloths embroidered with intricate Cherokee patterns. The sunlight hit the colorful threads, making them sparkle like dewdrops. They didn't talk much, but they felt each other's presence, a presence that was full and safe. Jed and Clara were playing in the garden, which had now become a small wilderness of their own. Wild Cherokee flowers bloomed next to the rows of corn, and the children ran and played, their laughter echoing through the valley. Jed, the once rigid boy, was now more open. He had learned that strength was not just in protecting, but also in loving. Ayanna looked at Elias, and she saw him smiling. It wasn't a big smile. It was just a slight curve of his lips, a smile created by contentment. Anh đưa con ngựa gỗ cho cô xem. Thế nào, anh hỏi, giọng anh dịu dàng. Ayanna lấy nó, vuốt ve lớp gỗ nhẵn bóng. Đẹp lắm, cô nói, và cô đặt nó vào túi áo của mình. But the horse in my heart will never be tamed. Elias looked at her, and he understood. He hadn't tamed her. He hadn't caged her. He had chosen her. At dusk, they stood on the porch, together. The sunset was pouring down, illuminating the valley. The landscape was still the same, wild hills, giant cacti, and a vast, boundless sky. But the house was different. The house now had a new room, with a large window. The warm light from inside spilled out, illuminating their faces. Elias placed his hand over Ayanna's. His palm was rough and calloused from labor, but it transmitted a warmth to her, a sense of safety. She felt the beat of his heart, steady and strong. She no longer felt the coldness of chains. She only felt the warmth of his hand. Elias looked towards the horizon, then into Ayanna's eyes. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. Everything had been said through actions, through choices, through love. He was no longer the man of the past. She was no longer a piece of property. They had found each other. They had chosen each other. I am no longer the old man, Elias said, his voice low, hoarse, and full of emotion. You are no longer a piece of property. We are a home. Ayanna didn't answer. She just squeezed his hand, and they stood there, together, under the reborn sky of hollow rock, where free souls had found a place to belong, not to be caged.